Get started. I know there are still folks trickling in, but they'll kind of continue to do that as the webinar rolls on. My name is Viktorya Vilk. I am the Program Director for Digital Safety and Free Expression at PEN America. We are a nonprofit that celebrates and defends the written word here in the US and internationally. And we have been advocating for a free and independent press since we were founded nearly 100 years ago. I'm gonna let Harlo, my co-host, co-leader, introduce herself. Harlo, why don't you come on, tell people who you are.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Harlo Holmes. I'm the Director of Digital Security at Freedom of the Press Foundation, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that helps connect 21st century journalists to 21st century digital security support.
It's always good to be within 1 century as a general rule. So welcome everyone to today's webinar on digital safety, privacy and surveillance. This webinar series is actually part of a partnership with not only PEN America and Freedom of the Press Foundation, but the International Women's Media Foundation, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. In recent weeks, we have seen journalists arrested and assaulted all across the country. The US Press Freedom Tracker is now investigating over 400 incidents of press freedom violations and counting, the vast majority of which seem to have been perpetrated by the police. And that is not even to mention the fact that protests largely peaceful against police brutality and systemic racism were actually met with more violence and brutality. So, in response to what we were seeing, a whole bunch of press freedom organizations teamed up. We're doing a lot of different kinds of work to advocate on behalf of journalists and protesters who are exercising their First Amendment rights at the moment. And this series is sort of part of that. The overall series is really focused on safety and well-being and mental health. It is, the majority of the content is sort of tailored to reporters, to professional reporters, but if you are on here and you are a citizen journalist or a protester or an activist, you are very welcome, and hopefully you'll find lots of useful content here for you too. We are going to be recording today's session and putting it online, but we will be very thoughtful about, not naming the various people who are here. You all know who we are. And the last kind of point I'll make is that today's session is focused on digital safety. On Thursday, we have a session focused on mental health and trauma, and it's led by the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma and by one of the leading experts on the issue of trauma and journalism in the entire country. I hope that you folks will join us at noon. We also have, we are thinking about adding webinars to this series. So if you have ideas about what you need as a sort of journalism community, please feel free to email me and give me some of your ideas. And to the extent possible, we will happily try to realize those webinars and make them available to you and to everyone else. And you'll have to forgive the background noise. Not much I can do. I have planes, there are police cars, there's helicopters. It's just the reality that I'm currently living in. So forgive the background noise. Okay. So I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap. So what a lot of folks don't realize, and what I didn't realize until I started doing more work on digital safety issues, is just how much our cell phones are telling on us to everyone all the time. And in this moment when folks are reporting on protests, commenting or participating in protests, that's not only a problem, a privacy problem, it's a very big privacy problem, but it's actually also a safety and security problem. And so what Harlo and I want to do today for you is to basically make you more aware of the ways in which your phone and your social media accounts might be sort of cheating, cheating on you, and so that you can make more thoughtful decisions about how you use these devices. We are going to focus on, first of all, trying to make a decision about whether you should bring your phone to a protest. We realize that for a lot of folks, not bringing a phone isn't going to be practical. So if you're going to bring a phone, what are things you can do to protect yourself from your phone and to protect your phone from others? We're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of post-protest surveillance that might be going on that all of us should be aware of and thoughtful about. And we're going to talk about some of the ways in which you can tighten your social media settings to protect yourself from abusive trolls and from others who might have ill will towards you on the internet. I do have a couple caveats. Well, actually, I forgot one thing. I forgot the housekeeping, which is to say that if you have questions, please use the Q&A. If you have comments or you want to offer your own resources or weigh in some way, use the chat. And Harlo and I will keep an eye on both the chat and the Q&A as we go, but we might kind of cluster the questions so that we can keep a steady rhythm. But my caveats. The first caveat is none of this is foolproof or airtight. Our phones and our apps basically are built to surveil us and to sell our information downstream. And the government has all kinds of surveillance technology that we don't even know about in some cases. So this guidance is really meant to help you mitigate risk, to be aware of your vulnerabilities so that you can make the choices that work for you. My other caveat is that not everyone has the same concerns, and not all of this guidance applies to everyone in the same way. So if, for example, you are a journalist versus if you're an activist or a protester versus if you're a protester who is undocumented, you might have a different kind of set of risks or concerns that you're dealing with. And so you might process this advice and choose to use it very differently. And I'm actually going to turn to Harlo and ask her to explain the idea of threat modeling and why we sort of have to use that and think about the profile of the person as you apply the advice to yourself.
Yeah, great introduction to that concept, Victoria. So when Victoria speaks about like the different hats that you might wear as you go out to cover an event, we do want to introduce the term threat modeling, which is what we use in digital security in order to explain the different nuances that you know, each hat that you wear is going to come with. And so it's usually like a question of what exactly is it that I'm trying to protect, and from whom am I trying to protect it from? And also what tools do I have at my disposal in order to be the most effective at this? And we do want you to think of these as like three different, I guess, personas that you might identify more or less with. One being that, you know, a public figure, a journalist who is working in, you know, the public interest, who might even have organizational backing, or at least from a freelancer's perspective, is pretty well supported in terms of like, you know, working with editors or fixers or stringers or whatever, and has like, you know, somewhat of institutional support. You don't need to be anonymous. You need to protect yourself, and you need to be as I guess nimble as possible in order to get that story, in order to report effectively on what you see on the ground. Meanwhile, then there might be, if you're going in more as I guess like an independent journalist who works for you know, a more a smaller news outlet that isn't very well supported, you might worry about your protecting your identity, because you are going to be out there with people getting very, very close. And not only are you worrying about protecting yourself from, I guess, the police, if should you be stopped and have your role as a member of the press questioned, you're also probably thinking about how best to protect the equipment that you brought into the field, because you probably can't get another one. And then there might be people who are, you know, whose identities are incredibly sensitive, whether that's because, you know, you are of of let's say undocumented or something like that. Or working for, or you know, trying to file a story for, like, let's say a blog that you write, or a podcast where you don't necessarily have that much support. Things can get a lot more dangerous for you, and so that's where you have to think more about like how to protect your identity. So as we or as we walk through any of these different tools and techniques and skills, keep that in mind, that there are we're going to focus on three specific approaches. And none of this advice is going to be one size fits all.
So the first question is, do you bring your phone? And I'm going to ask Harlo. We're going to be doing a lot of back and forth. Harlo here is the cybersecurity expert, and I'm the sort of ringleader. I don't know what to call myself, but and also someone who's learning a lot about cybersecurity as I go. But Harlo, talk me through the kinds of signals that our phones are sending out, oftentimes without our knowledge or awareness.
Yeah. So fundamentally, your phone is going to have a number of different radios on them. The radios, by which I mean they send and receive stuff from radio signals in the air. Uh, we like to think about like the cell tower radio. So the radio that facilitates your connection to cell towers in order to receive phone calls and to receive regular text messages. That's one type of radio. That's also where you get things like emergency broadcasts and weather alerts and things like that. But then you also have a couple of other radios. You have your Wi-Fi radio. That's a totally separate piece of equipment on your phone, and that's how you interact with hotspots and get like the internet onto your phone. And then you also have Bluetooth, which is for like very, very close distance interaction, usually with things like your headphones or, you know, your ear pods or your Fitbit or your watch. But it also can interact with other devices in the area. So if you have been listening to developments around contact tracing for COVID-19, that is, a radio that's leveraged in that. And also, we've started to see more and more over the past couple of years that these Bluetooth radios interact with certain elements in architecture. So like in certain shopping malls, you might be advertised to based off of Bluetooth. Or as you walk around New York City and interact with like, you know, those like kiosks that we have on the streets. So these are just three different types of radios that can be really, really helpful and efficient, but also in certain situations have been used by state apparatuses in order to surveil people. So to answer the question, I mean, we'll get to the question, shall I bring my phone? But whatever you decide, just know that these are the different types of ways that your phone is transmitting at all times.
And you need to know this because it will help explain some of the guidance that Harlo and I offer in relation to, do you take your phone and how do you treat your phone if you do take it? So, your options. Your first option is to leave your smartphone at home. Your second option is to bring a dummy or a burner phone. And your third option is, if you're going to bring your smartphone, do some prep work on it before you leave your house. So I'm going to ask Harlo to talk us through, first of all, what is a burner phone and what do you look for in a burner phone? And then second of all, what are some of the pros and cons of these options?
So you might have heard the term a burner phone being tossed around quite frequently, nowadays especially. And what that is it's a separate phone that is totally different from, you know, the phone that you use for day-to-day use, that you can use simply to, just better protect your personal data as you go out into the field. So this has two advantages. One is for your, how efficient you can be at doing your job. These are often scenarios where we have seen, if you've been listening to, you know, the reporting that we've been doing via the Press Freedom Tracker and other outlets, where it's very prevalent for journalists to have their device either seized or confiscated by police, or to run into a situation where, it's physically dangerous and things get out of hand and you end up dropping it on the phone and, like a whole bunch of people smash your phone with their feet. Either way, you do want to, or having a dummy or a burner phone is advantageous because you don't expose your personal data, like your years worth of Gmail and, personal photos and correspondence to somebody who might take your phone. And also you don't, get into trouble should something happen physically to damage your device.
So my understanding, and Harlo, I want you to jump in if I'm wrong, that you particularly want to leave your phone at home if you are, so the issue is that if you have all these like different kinds of radio signals being sent out from your phone in real time, what that means is that your phone is basically helping to physically locate you at a particular time at a particular place. And if it's your phone and not a burner phone, it's probably connected to your name and identity. And so
Yes.
You might be someone who wants to leave your phone at home if you don't want to be connected to a particular place at a particular time, or you don't want your identity kind of confirmed and broadcast out there. But again, it's not really practical for a lot of folks to leave their phones at home, which is why we suggest a burner or a dummy phone, with the understanding that not everyone can afford one, It's not practical for everybody. So if you can't leave your phone at home and you can't take a dummy or a burner phone, we're going to talk you through some of the things that you can do to prep your smartphone and to have an understanding of sort of what your, like what the pros and cons are of what you do with your phone if you bring it. So, before you leave for a protest, some steps you can take to protect your phone. I'm using this slide kind of as a checklist. If anybody wants to take a screenshot of it, they are welcome to, although as I said, we'll post a recording of this webinar. We're then going to actually walk you through the different steps that are listed here. Some of this, I should say, you can do now. Some of this you might want to be a little bit cautious about doing now because A, it might not be relevant when you're sitting in your house, and B, you don't want to do something kind of cavalierly. Let's say create a really, really long passcode, forget to write it down right now in the moment, and then not be able to get into your own phone. So you might just want to take a screenshot of this checklist. We're going to show you how to do each of these things, and then that way you can come back later if you want to actually implement them. But that's your call. It's your decision. So let's start with the first one, backing up your phone. In all of these slides, we're going to give you instructions in iPhone and we're going to give you instructions in Android, like pathways you can follow in the settings of your phone. With iPhones, it's pretty straightforward. The settings are all very similar on several different generations of iPhone. With Android, it really varies. So if we don't have it exactly right, you'll have to forgive us because we couldn't fill the slide with 10 different ways of doing it on 10 different Androids. But I think this should give you the general sense of where to find this stuff. So the reason you want to back up your phone, if your phone is confiscated, broken, or lost, you obviously don't want to lose loads of data that you have on there, particularly if you're a reporter, if you were taking notes on it, if you were using it professionally, but really if you're anybody, you don't want to have all that stuff lost. But whether you actually back up a phone on the cloud or you do it on some kind of local device like your computer or something else in your house, it has pros and cons. And so I'm just going to ask Harlo to kind of weigh in on when you might want to do one and when you might want to do the other. Harlo? You there? You might be on mute. I don't know if you've unmuted yourself, but I can't hear you. I also can't see you. Hello? Well, I will do my best to muddle on without Harlo, but we kind of need Harlo. So I'm going to send her a quick text to make sure that she hasn't been disconnected and she's not having internet trouble. And then I'm going to kind of full steam ahead and do my best. Oh, well, we can't hear you, Harlo. So you might be on mute. You might need to unmute yourself because I was hoping you could talk about kind of backing up to the cloud or backing up on a local device. Or you might want to try exiting the Zoom and coming back, but I'm going to keep going and come back to you. Just when you're back, just start talking and I'll shut up. So whether or not you back up to a local device or the cloud, again, depends on your profile and the things that you are trying to keep from whoever it is you are trying to keep them from. If you are, concerned about surveillance or access to your data, the cloud might not be the best place to back up your sensitive or secure communications or photos or whatever it is. If your primary concern is just not to lose something, then the cloud works great and it's actually easier and better. If you are concerned about surveillance and not having stuff accessible, I would actually recommend finding a local device. When I say local, I mean in your house, right? Or somewhere where you keep things private on your computer or somewhere else to back up instead. Harlo, can you say something? I want to make sure I see you're back. Hopefully this has solved whatever technical problem we were having. Oh, you know what? Let me try. Folks, I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. We tested everything out, but it never, you still never know. Mysteriously, Harlo has lost all audio capacity for reasons I can't begin to understand. So I'm going to ask, now that she's co-host, if she could kind of play around in Zoom to try to figure out what's happening with Blythe, if Blythe could help her. And I'm going to keep going because I don't want to hold people up. And worst case scenario, Harlo will type chat answers in if it gets to that point. All right, so we're going to keep going. So we talked about backing up your phone. I also want to talk about encrypting your phone. So the good news is your iPhone is effectively, like by default, the data on your iPhone is encrypted. If you want to just double check because it'll give you peace of mind, or you just want to see how you know that, if you go to settings and Face ID and passcode and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you should have, there should be in gray at the bottom something like data is protected or data is encrypted. I think it says data is protected. In Android, depending on the Android you have, it might be default or it might be something you actually have to turn on. So I strongly recommend that you do so. And those are the kind of general instructions: security, advanced encryption, and credentials, encrypt phone. I'll leave this up for another hot minute in case anyone wants to actually go in and do that. That is something you should do right now if your Android is not encrypted. And I'm gonna just check again. I know Harlo is now coming up with a hack where she's calling into the webinar instead of, Harlo, can you say something? Just praying that you're back.
Hi.
Yay! This is very good. I really wanted you to be here. Okay.
It could be better, but I think my computer's microphone blew out, so I had to call in with the audio.
In the middle of a webinar. What could be better? Okay, well, we make do. But now you got your phone, so it's all good. Thank you very much for figuring out a solution to that problem. Will you talk us through encryption on the data on your phone? So I sort of walked people through the kind of basics of how to do it, and iPhone has it, and Android you sometimes have to implement, but talk us through, like, what does it mean to encrypt your data on your phone, and just in a nutshell.
Sure. So encryption means that when your phone is powered off, then all of its contents are scrambled, and so no one can see it or change it behind your back. And that's really, really ideal in the case that someone, takes your device from you, because otherwise they could do exactly what it is, whatever they want with it. And so this is why iPhones have been encrypted by default for a number of years. And this is also why more and more Android phones have encryption turned on by default. You should always, as Victoria says, you should always check that the settings are, set up to your liking. But manufacturers already realize that this is a huge benefit for all of our privacy and security. So yes, please do that.
Great. All right. We're getting into the nitty-gritty a little bit more. You want to be very careful about Face ID and Touch ID, and you 100% want to have a passcode enabled on your phone, and you want that passcode to be long and complicated. So if you are detained or arrested, technically the police cannot, I want to emphasize, cannot force you to use either biometrics like your face or your finger, or passcodes to open your phone. Theoretically, they need a warrant. Not theoretically, I mean, they need a warrant. The issue is that it is in some ways easier to intimidate you physically or coerce or pressure you to hold your face up to your phone or hold your phone up to your face or to your hand than it is to get a passcode out of you if you don't want to say it. So depending again on your profile and what you're concerned about, you can either turn off Face and Touch ID and just use your passcode, or we'll talk through some hacks, but well, not really hacks, they're like shortcuts. But in terms of the length of the passcode, I should just say that Harlo and I are friends, and I sort of very proudly told Harlo that I changed my passcode on my phone and made it 6 numbers. And I thought I was going to get praise, and that is not what I got. I got criticism. And it turns out that 6 numbers is not enough, and Harlo is going to explain why.
Sure. So law enforcement agencies across the globe have access to these devices that are made by digital forensic firms that are sold across the nation, across the globe, that actually leverage the fact that they can try a whole bunch of combinations in order to unlock a phone if it falls into like an evidence locker. And so this is why as these devices get more efficient and utilize vulnerabilities in more sophisticated ways, the best protection that you have is to make it harder for those devices to do exactly that. And so this is why it's no longer sufficient to have a 6-number passcode, but instead what we recommend is having a passcode that is about 10 characters and consists of letters and numbers.
So when Harlo told me that, my first thought is, honestly, like, how practical is that? Like, if I'm outside and I have to enter 10 different numbers and digits and things into my phone every time I need to do anything, I would go insane. But first of all, it is important to understand that you can access the photo and video on your phone, even if your phone is locked, usually by swiping. On an iPhone, it's swiping from right to left. I don't know, it probably varies by Android, and you can even make it wherever you want. It does, right? So you can access phone and video no matter what. But an alternative that Harlo proposed, which I'll have her walk through, is basically you can leave your Face or Touch ID on. You have a really long, complicated passcode, but that's annoying, right? So you leave your Face or Touch ID on, but you know how to very quickly lock your phone up so that it is, just explain to Harlo, I'm not explaining it very well.
Sure.
Explain the idea that you're
yeah, so as Victoria says, we have come to the conclusion, Victoria and I, that it's worth it to have a challenging passcode, but we also don't want to lock ourselves out of our devices entirely. And so go ahead and before you go out there, practice what's called lockdown mode, which is a physical gesture, it depends on the phone that you have, that clears that biometric lock. So the next time you want to open up the phone again, you have to put in this Touch ID. And not only should you, like kind of look up where to find that feature on the phone that you have, but also try practicing it a couple of times and know how many seconds it might take you to successfully clear that biometric from its cache. I can say in my experience, it takes me 4 seconds to go into lockdown mode on my phone. And that combined with situational awareness is a really, really excellent compromise.
Thank you for that. And just to like case study, right? Like, let's say you're out covering a protest and you can just feel that the mood has changed and the police are starting to close in. Maybe they're about to kettle people. That would be a really good moment to enter this lockdown mode on your phone. So the whole time you have your long passcode, but it's annoying. So you've got your Face and your Touch ID on, but in that moment, when you feel that things are starting to change, go ahead and enable that lockdown. And that way you'll have to enter your passcode next time. And if you're asked for it, you just say no, because they need a warrant for that. So the other point I want to make is that for iPhones, and I'm sorry, I have an iPhone, it's a little bit different for Androids, but when you're in the Face ID and passcode part of an iPhone, there's a section that says sort of allow access when locked. And the question is like, what are things you can get to on your phone, even when your phone is locked down? So your camera and your video are one of those things, right? That's great. But Harlo pointed out that it's actually really important to turn off USB accessories and to turn on erased data. And I'm going to have her just quickly explain why.
Sure. And there's also similar features on Android, which I can explain as well. But ultimately, these devices that I was talking about before that law enforcement agencies make use of, one of the ways that they do bypass a lot of our restrictions has to do with accessing your device via a USB accessory. So that means they can just stick, their gray box into your your iPhone via Thunderbolt, and they can start to get to work on it. So that's one aspect. In Android, a correlate, I think, a comparable feature is, it's not exactly the same, but pretty comparable, is making sure that when you plug in via USB, like let's say to a computer, it only charges. It doesn't actually like show up as, a media device or a storage device or something like that. And then there's also the erase data feature, which means that after 10 unsuccessful attempts at trying a passcode, your phone will pretty much nuke itself. It will factory reset itself.
Right. So the idea is you want to couple that with backing up regularly, right? Like you want to back up your phone. And I asked Harlo, well, what happens if like I forget my passcode and I keep entering it and I can't get it right? What did you say to me?
Well, I mean, ultimately, we shouldn't forget our passcodes to unlock our phones. That there isn't really too much getting around that because you would need to, you know, under normal circumstances, take that phone to the Genius Bar when the Genius Bars open up again and have them reset your phone in such a way that you can actually restore it again from your iCloud backup. But as long as you are performing regular backups in a way that makes sense to you, a combination of cloud backups and local backups, however you want to do it, you should be in a good position to carry on in the case of that something happens to your device.
Right. And this is why I say don't necessarily change your passcode right now, because you want to make sure that once you've created a long passcode, it's in your brain, or at least you write it down somewhere really private and hide it so that if you forget it, you can go fish it out and find it. But I do think what Harlo said was that if the erased data happens if somebody tries to log in 10 times into your phone, and I think that has to do with it happening like kind of rapidly, like as if there are different permutations that are trying to be used. So it's hard to imagine somebody would try 10 different times to get into their own phone. But just so you understand the kind of pros and cons and the realities of what you're doing to your phone. All right, next. This was another one of those Victoria's bubble gets burst moments because, you know, I've been reading all these guides and tip sheets that say that it's a really good idea to turn off location tracking on your phone. And I felt very good about the fact that I had been doing that every time I went outside to participate in protests. But Harlo expressed some skepticism about that. Again, I'm showing you how to do it so that you know how to do it, but it's important to understand the limitations of what you're doing so that you don't have a false sense of security. So. Yeah,
I think that that's a good way of putting it. So location services are it's great to learn how to turn off your location settings because as I think you can kind of deduce from the way that it's laid out, this protects your privacy way more than it protects your security as far as, let's say, going to an event or an action is concerned. And the reason why is because you do want to, because you're using a phone, no matter what, there is going to be a certain amount of location data that Google or Apple has about you. And not only Google and Apple, but also, you know, the company like Sprint or T-Mobile or whatever that you're paying money to. And that is just part and parcel of owning a phone. And as long as your phone receives calls and text messages, there's no getting around it. What the privacy benefit is that you want to limit what third parties have access to. So is it so important that Yelp knows your location because they're just turning that into extra money? It's definitely really, really important that, like, you know, the game of Sudoku that you download, it doesn't have access to your location services because they're just turning that around and contributing to like a very, very like detailed advertising profile. And so from like our civil liberties perspective, by all means, take advantage of, you know, the location services in order to like totally make sure that you're reining in who has exposure to that. But as far as your security and anonymity is concerned, what is going to happen if ever someone was under investigation, the FBI is not going to ask Yelp where you were if you were at the protest. The FBI will instead ask Google specifically for all of the subscribers that they saw in the area. And just because that's the most efficient and like the most, I guess, like legally sanctioned way of going about that data. So don't, you know, like lull yourself into a false sense of security about what pruning the data privacy settings can do for you.
Thank you, Harlo. So someone just asked about airplane mode. We're going to get to that in a minute. And I actually think we're going to probably have to pick, and I say this for us both, we're going to have to pick up the pace a little bit so we can get through some of the stuff we want to walk people through. But part of the reason we were going a little bit slow is because some of the stuff's a little bit nuanced and complicated, but we're going to go a little bit faster. So more important than turning off location tracking, which you're by all means encouraged to do, just to understand that it doesn't mean that your location will not actually be accessible or available, is to turn off notifications. Because if, let's say, you did a really good job, you've got a really long passcode, your phone is locked down, so there's no way that anyone can open it. If you've got notifications popping up from the top, in real time that are visible to people, let's say somebody's messaging on Signal or some other app or whatever, it kind of defeats the purpose. So
this is actually my favorite anecdote, and I won't go into too much detail, but like ultimately, if someone does confiscate your phone, and even if you're using Signal, when the notification bubble pops up, they'll just take your phone, put it face down in a photocopier, and that's how it enters into evidence. So notifications, it's important.
Turn those off. Yeah, so again, this is stuff that you do before you leave your house to cover a protest or to participate in a protest. So in iPhone, we've got the instructions for you. Again, Android, it varies a little bit, but you can just turn on don't show notifications. You can also fine tune it by app. So you can go into Signal or iMessage or Slack and make sure that the notifications are off for that app. I find it easier to just turn off notifications when I'm outside or when I'm, if I were meeting with sensitive sources, but I'm not. So in terms of Android, there's another thing that you can do in Android, which is actually scroll to the very bottom of the page where you're kind of regulating your notification settings and just toggle off sensitive notifications. And so apps that have, if I've understood Harlo correctly, apps that have identified themselves as having potentially sensitive communications like Signal, which we'll talk about in a minute, will then have their notifications turned off. Again, I personally prefer to just turn off notifications, but it's your call if you want to fine tune it so that it's more convenient for you. Someone's asking, Harlo, what if your alerts don't show the body of the message?
If that works for you, then that's great. That's what I really like about Signal, is that they allow you to fine tune it in exactly that way. Yeah.
Right. So now let's say you have done all the things before you left your house to participate or cover a protest. And now you are actually out and about. Some other things to keep in mind about your phone. And again, this is a checklist in case anybody wants to screenshot it, but then we're going to walk you quickly through some of the things on this checklist. All right. In an ideal world, you would keep your phone off as much as possible because we've just been explaining, right? Your phone is sending all these different signals through Wi-Fi, through Bluetooth, through the sort of pinging cell phone towers in real time, all the time. So in an ideal world, you turn off your phone. But again, that isn't practical for everybody. So you can use airplane mode. And it's really, really easy on most phones to swipe from the top and turn on airplane mode. However, if all you do is airplane mode and you don't attend to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, you're not really protecting yourself in the way that you think that you are. So I'll let Harlo, if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Just remember that we had started out by saying that there's more than one radio on your phone. There are upwards of 3. And Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are also, like heavily used as indicators for, people's personal identity. So if you've ever listened to Spotify through your AirPods on an airplane, you know that you can still use Bluetooth very, very easily, even if you're in airplane mode. And also do know that in both Android and iOS, there are shortcuts in order for you to disable Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, but especially as far as Bluetooth is concerned, that actually doesn't turn the Bluetooth radios off. It just puts them in passive scanning mode. And so there's still potentially looking at and not necessarily interacting with, but they are definitely transmitting into the air. So you actually have to dig into your settings in order to make sure you fully disable these radios, not just go with the shortcuts.
Well, I just want to say, not to intimidate people, because when Harlo says dig into your settings, at least on an iPhone, I think on Androids too, you don't actually have to dig. You basically open your settings, and all the way at the top is airplane mode, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. So yeah, if it's any reassurance,
it's a lot easier on iOS, I would say.
3 buttons, whereas I think in Android it's a little bit more annoying depending on the Android that you have. But
Yes.
I've been doing this work for a while, and I don't know why, but the fact that the shortcuts are lying to you really, really got to me. Like it just made me somehow more mad than some of the other things I know about surveillance and tracking. But so it's good to know, even if it's infuriating.
And I guess like this is I mean, it's a good reason why we also decided to include the like, okay, if you're really worried about these things, especially worried about these things, and you don't want to dig through the settings because you're not sure that you know, like did it all correctly, the easiest thing you can do is to get a Faraday bag, which, you know, it's an expense. But it works very, very well because you can just throw the phone in the bag and forget about like, you know, digging through all the settings.
Because the bag, just to be clear, the bag basically does not allow your phone to project out signals.
What it does is it blocks radio signals. It's made of a special fabric that blocks radio signals. And so your phone will try, but it can't actually transmit anything. And conversely, radios elsewhere, transmitters in the environment around you will try to reach your phone, but it has absolutely no way of getting those radio waves through the bag.
Thank you for that. That was, I learned about Faraday bags from you. Among many other things. So in an ideal world, first of all, you should assume that any communications you're sending from your phone when you're out in a protest are at least attempting to be intercepted, if not actually intercepted. So in an ideal world, you're not really sending sensitive communications from your phone. Again, that isn't practical for everyone, depending on what you're doing outside. Say if you're trying to organize people. So the ideal thing to do is to use an encrypted messaging app. Again, Harlo explained encryption earlier. It basically garbles your communications so that even if someone were to intercept them, they can't actually understand or see what those communications say. The gold standard is Signal. You can also use something like Wire, or you can even use WhatsApp. My note of caution about WhatsApp is that WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. So to the degree that you feel safe and secure trusting Facebook, you can use WhatsApp, but Signal is definitely what a lot of folks in the sort of security industry and journalism industry recommend. But what you need to understand is that both parties on either side have to have the messaging app and be using the messaging app, right? So you need both people downloading Signal and using it, both people on WhatsApp and using it. And there are some notes of caution around iMessage, which I will allow Harlo to, or rather ask Harlo.
Yeah. So iMessage is, for all intents and purposes, end-to-end encrypted, but there are a couple of caveats in usage. One, and this is just real quick, if your iMessages are in your iCloud, they're not end-to-end encrypted there. So they're just regularly encrypted to Apple, and that could be subpoenable, let's say. There's also the idea that if you've noticed, sometimes when you're iMessaging people, the messages are in blue. But if you're talking to someone who does not have iMessage, i.e. somebody who's on an Android, the messages are green. And that means that they're just going over plain text messages, which is the most dangerous medium to ever speak about confidential communications over. Like, don't use regular SMS messages. Another like particularly dangerous part about that is unless you actually fiddle with the settings, I say that a lot, but fiddle with the settings, you can actually, like let's say if you're in a protest where law enforcement is actually affecting people's telecommunications, they can force you to disconnect from the iMessage server, and then your SMS or your iMessages will default to going to other iPhone users over SMS. So unless you explicitly say within your iMessage settings, do not fall over or fail over to SMS, that can actually happen, and that has happened in the past.
So the moral of the story is to use an end-to-end encrypted messaging app, ideally Signal, and to get other people to be using it too if you have to communicate in sensitive ways. If you're just telling somebody you're going to be home at whatever for dinner at 7, probably not something you have to worry about. But if it's sensitive communications for whatever reason, use Signal. Okay, so we've talked about, before you go out to protest, we've talked about things to keep in mind when you're out in a protest, covering it, reporting on it. Some things to keep in mind about protest surveillance. Another thing that's important to understand, which a lot of you probably on this call already know, is that police departments review social media and video, sometimes in real time, sometimes after a protest, to gather intelligence about the various people who are participating or who were there, identify individuals, link them to a particular place in a particular time, and potentially even arrest them. So for everybody on this call, and I should say, I understand that journalists have ethics and training around, you know, whose images they include in photos, whether they have consent or permission, etc. So I understand that people know that, but I would just say for anybody, if you're a citizen journalist and you're trying to record something or witness something, etc., just make sure that you are mindful about exposing the identity of people who are there. And if you can request permission whenever possible, especially if you're actually taking a real close-up of somebody as opposed to something that's from, you know, the back, from up high or something like that, in your own, any of your own images, again, citizen journalist, professional journalist, whatever you are, if you're near your home or your neighborhood, make sure that you're not accidentally including in a photo an intersection or the front of your house with an address. And if you're laughing at me right now thinking like, why is this woman telling me these things? I can tell you now that in the last several months, like all of us, I have been in a lot of webinars and a lot of Zoom meetings, and I have seen people accidentally expose their phone number, their home address, and all kinds of other information without at all realizing that they don't even know who's actually on the Zoom with them. Or conversely, if it's, you know, a photo. So just be thoughtful about that, especially right now. And then I would say generally to think twice about live streaming. I've seen people live streaming everywhere constantly in these protests, and I understand some of why that happens, but it does have implications about inadvertently exposing people who are in the frame. So those are kind of my few thoughts. Harlo, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would underscore the like thinking twice about live streaming. If you are, especially if you're like, you know, with a smaller outlet and you're streaming to like Facebook Live or Instagram or something like that, and you're, or Periscope or whatever, and you're just participating in a hashtag. Once again, everyone is a professional, and so we understand exactly like, you know, where our duty of care lies. But just know that for every police department has a room full of people who just follow the same hashtags all day and look at user-generated content, because at this point it's user-generated content. They're not thinking about the journalistic merits and the journalistic importance of what you're streaming. What they're doing is they're looking for user-generated content, and then they're applying a lot of like intelligence techniques in order to just like pick out people, places, and things and feed it into a crime database. So think about that as you go out there with the camera.
Thank you. So last couple points, and I'll mostly hand over to Harlo to cover these, but in terms of blurring faces and images and metadata in images. So Harlo, go ahead and take it from here.
Sure. Okay. So metadata. So what we're talking about is like visual data, which is what we see, and this is why we might want to use some sort of technique in order to redact certain parts of an image, like people's faces. There was a new iPhone shortcut that came out that was by these like artists that has been getting good reviews. I haven't personally reviewed it myself. There's an app called Obscuracam, which is for Android, which has been around for a number of years. Fun fact, it was my first job out of grad school. That performs reliable redaction on Android. Signal also has a blurring feature that is pretty robust that they just employed in the newest version of Signal, which is great. But then there's, and so like, please take, the time to do that. Once again, duty of care, take the time to redact things that are particularly sensitive in still images before getting those things out there. But then there's also metadata, which is the data that we don't see, which is stuff like, geolocation, camera make and models, any other types of information that is just like pretty much like text-based narrative that accompanies a photo that can be used. And a lot of people don't necessarily think about that when they're posting. But ultimately, once again, like portals like Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, actually have law enforcement portals where you can just ask for a bunch of metadata in order to further investigation, rather than even like looking at the visual content. So there's always going to be just similar to physical photos in our hands. There is the glossy side with the photo, and then there's the back of it that has like the timestamp of when they printed it out at the Walmart. Like that's you still have to think of photos in that same way, even though they're digital.
And so kind of quick hacks include, if you want to try to clear the metadata out of a photo, is at the very least just take a screenshot of the photo and then use the screenshot, which you can do in 2 seconds. Or you can actually in Signal send the photo to yourself, and Signal will remove the metadata from the photo and then post that photo. So it's a simple thing, but it's really useful to know about. If again, I just want to be totally clear. Not all of this advice applies to everyone. Not everyone is necessarily concerned with their location being kind of exposed through a photo or something like that. Just think about what your profile is, and also think about who you're photographing or in what context, and then you can make decisions about what works for you. But we just want you to know that this stuff is out there and that you can access it in some cases easily, and a lot of it truly isn't very hard or time consuming to do. My last non-technical tip is, and I'm sure you folks have heard a lot about this, but I'm just going to emphasize it. Most of us no longer have phone numbers memorized in our heads. And so it is a good idea to write somewhere, either on your arm or have it hidden somewhere on a piece of paper, a couple key contacts. Ideally, a lawyer, if you are detained or arrested. I would say especially if you're a journalist, but really just anyone. For journalists, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has a 24/7 legal defense hotline. If you are in another part of the country and you happen to know that there is a law firm offering pro bono support to journalists, which has been happening, even better, contact that local law firm, because Reporters Committee will often kind of refer people. They're not kind of legal counsel in most cases directly. But if not, at least call them, write that number down, and make sure that you have an emergency contact of a close friend or a family member written somewhere on your person or in a piece of paper in your pocket, so that if your phone is confiscated or broken or it dies, you can still access people that you need, whom you need. I'm mindful of the time. So this has taken a little bit longer than Harlo and I anticipated in terms of timing. So I want to do 2 things. I want to quickly run through this 2 or 3 questions that we haven't already addressed in the questions. And so I'm going to take a minute to address those. And then I'm going to actually ask you folks about how we want to proceed in terms of how much time we have. So the first question, Harlo, you can probably see some of them. So there's a question on, you mentioned Faraday bags. Are there any that you particularly recommend or think are good?
Yeah, my favorite one is by this company called Mission Darkness. It's really, really cute. It's very well made and it works pretty well. So,
Mission Darkness,
yeah.
Faraday bags.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And then the next question is, generally known, so IMSI catchers or stingrays allow law enforcement to spoof a legitimate cell tower and trick the smartphone into connecting directly to the stingray, which Harlo had talked about before. Is there any solution to this tricking, or can we somehow prevent it? Is using Signal enough? Thoughts?
That's a very good question. So bad news is not so much. There have been attempts to reliably track stingrays and other types of IMSI catchers over the years, but it's really, it's a type of technology that definitely does go a little bit beyond like citizens' resources. Not only do, like IMSI catchers can be in in a backpack worn by some guy who looks like he's a protester, but he's actually there to like monitor people. Or they could be flown in planes over our heads. There's and like a variety of different techniques are applied just about everywhere, every night in this country. So I would not, I wouldn't think that you can kind of like have a David and Goliath situation using like an app or something like that. Ultimately, I think that the advice that we gave was sound in that it covers your bases. If that is something that you're willing to accept, then go ahead and bring your phone. If that's something that that gives you pause, then you bring a burner phone. If that's something you want to avoid, you don't bring a phone. And I really, really don't think that there's another way to negotiate that. I don't.
So there was another question about not being able to find blur faces on the App Store. So I just want to be totally clear. There's not an app for blurring faces. Well, Signal, which is an app, can blur faces, but there's not an app from iPhone on blurring faces. There are a group of folks who've basically created a shortcut that they'll walk you through how to install on your phone, on your iPhone, that helps you blur faces. What I'm going to do is after this webinar, when I post the recording, I'm going to email all of you, basically everyone who signed up, and I'm going to include a couple of really good tip sheets on cybersecurity and covering protests, and I'm also going to include a link to the various blurring apps or features or shortcuts that have come out, and you'll see it, but you won't find it in the App Store. So that was just my bad for not being clear. And then somebody else, I think, asked Harlo, do you recommend people use VPNs on their phones?
Yes, and so actually I like that question because it is a follow-up to the second part of the previous question, which is about using Signal. In regards to IMSI catchers, so the thing about using Signal or using any app is that just by using Signal, it definitely like encrypts, very, very successfully encrypts the conversation, the content of the conversation that you're having, but it does not obfuscate the fact that you are using Signal, for instance. So as these IMSI catchers are flying overhead, it is entirely possible. I mean, I would be surprised if they didn't already understand that, like, okay, this group of people are using Signal because they see people hitting cell phone towers or using Wi-Fi that they control that says, you don't know what it is that I'm saying, but you do know that I'm visiting signal.org very, very frequently. The only way to kind of obfuscate that would actually be to use a VPN on your phone. And I have, like, you know, my recommendations for choosing a VPN. We also have on our training site, you know, like a couple of resources for choosing a VPN. But ultimately, this is one of those preparations that you might do in finding the one that works the best for you. So if you're using a VPN, someone who can see what's going on the network, whether that's from a Stingray or from a Wi-Fi network or something, all they see is that someone is connected to a VPN, and they can't tell if it's Signal or WhatsApp or, you know, Twitter or whatever underneath inside of that encrypted tunnel.
Thank you, Harlo. Just a quick note to my wonderful intern who's on this call. Can you make a note that we should add to the digital safety resources? Harlo has a couple good links on kind of how to pick a good VPN. I just want to make sure we include that. I hadn't thought of that. So that's a good, thank you, folks. All right, so I want to have a quick check-in with our participants. We have not had attrition. We keep getting more people, which is great. That makes me feel like this is actually useful and relevant to people. We had originally planned for this to be 75 minutes, so it was going to be done at, was it 2:15? But we definitely have a half hour's worth of content left. If you want us to run over, if you want us to go the full 30 minutes, go ahead and pop into the chat. I want to just get a sense of, do people want us to keep going, or do we want to wrap up? How are we feeling? Because let me just tell you what we're going to walk through so you can decide if it's actually relevant to you. What we were going to walk through is social media settings. So a lot of us don't understand just how much our social media settings are deliberately set to project as much information about us that is private into the world as possible without telling us. It's kind of how the whole system is based. So we can walk you through your social media settings. to understand some of the ways that you can try to be tighter and more thoughtful about your social media settings. And then we're also going to offer this is mostly connected to trolling and abuse, but it is not disconnected from surveillance. And we're also going to I can offer a couple of very, very basic cybersecurity tips, most of which you know, but may need a reminder about. So it sounds like let's keep going. And for those of you who have to leave early, no offense will be taken. Do what you got to do, and we'll send a recording around so you can watch the last, whatever, 15 minutes if you have to leave. Harlo, are you okay with that? Can you go till 2:30?
Yeah.
Great.
I am pretty sure I can. Yep, I'm good. I'm good until 3.
Good. Well, we're not going to go until 3. I have a meeting at 2:30, but we can go till 2:30.
Okay.
And I really appreciate your flexibility, you staying on, and all the wonderful advice that you're giving people on guidance. So I'm going to run through the next kind of chunk of stuff, and I'll keep an eye on chats, but a lot of the questions in chats I'm going to save towards the end, unless it's in real time, somebody is stuck with something and needs help. We have talked about phones. We have talked about kind of covering protest. Now we're going to switch to kind of basically somewhere between your phone and your computer. I actually encourage you for this section to have your phones and your computers out and to do a lot of this stuff in real time. Not all of it, and I'll be clear about what it's not a good idea to do in real time because you might muddle it and then get frustrated later. But for the most part, what we're going to be talking you through, it's probably doesn't hurt to do it in real time. Otherwise, you might forget and not come back and do it. Some very simple, basic cybersecurity, which probably there's like, if I could see people's faces, there'd be eye rolls happening everywhere. And yet somehow when I actually do polls in webinars or live in a room and I ask people who's actually doing this, very few hands go up. So I'm going to go ahead and say it again. It is a really good idea to use long, complicated passwords that are all different from one another. And again, this is another one of those things where Harlo and I have had debates over the years. I used to tell people that their passwords needed to be at least 10 characters. When it comes to sensitive accounts like your bank account or your Gmail or your social media accounts, you really need to have longer passwords than that. You need to have 16 characters. Ideally, you can use a passphrase like, my favorite one is like correct course, battery staple, or something like that, a bunch of different words strung together, maybe throw some numbers in there. You want to pick really difficult security questions that nobody could guess or Google. It is very, very easy to find your mother's maiden name or find where you went to high school. Even someone who does not have the kind of hacking prowess that I do can probably find your mother's maiden name in about 1 minute. So I would recommend that you either make a maiden name up for your mother or you come up with something nobody could Google. If you're trying to figure out how you're going to keep track of all of this stuff in your brain, and if you don't have a very good memory, which I don't, I strongly advise you to consider getting a password manager. It centralizes your passwords in one place and auto-generates long, complicated passwords, and you can adjust the settings to make them as long and complicated as you want or feel secure about. Most of these are free. LastPass and Dashlane are free. 1Password is really one of the best that is out there. It costs money, except for journalists. They have a free version for journalists, which is fantastic. If you go to 1Password, type in journalists, you can find it. I strongly advise you to set up a mobile, let me explain. Well, actually, I'm gonna ask Harlo to explain. Harlo, what's SIM-jacking?
SIM-jacking is when someone, usually a troll on the internet, calls up your phone company and impersonates you in order to get the phone company to assign your phone number to a device that they control. And so that means that they get to receive all your phone calls, all your text messages, all your two-factor authentication codes, and anything else that you might need to get through your life. And it's an incredibly harmful attack that is unfortunately really, really easy to pull off, which is pretty bad because phone numbers are increasingly like stand-ins for, ID numbers or passport numbers or a variety of other identifiers that we have that signify our lives. So this is why it's particularly dangerous.
Yes. So the very simple way that you can actually address this issue is to call your cell phone company and ask that they place a code on any changes to be made to your account. So you basically say, put this code, and if anyone comes pretending to be me, they won't know the code. They won't be able to redirect my traffic on my phone. The only obvious word of caution is don't pick a code that is like your birthday or your mother's birthday or your dad's birthday, because chances are people can easily figure that out. So just pick a code that people can't guess. And finally, keep your software and your apps up to date. I know that sounds really trivial and boring, but a lot of times software apps are because a major tech company has heard that they have a massive security bug and quietly tried to fix it in the hopes that no attention will be drawn to their massive security bug. And so actually, updating regularly means that you're closing those gaps, hopefully when they arise, or as soon afterwards as the company figures out that they have a bug. What I don't have on here is two-factor authentication because we're about to talk about it, but don't think that because it's not on this list, it's not important. It's probably like the single most important thing you can do in addition to having password hygiene. And two-factor authentication, on the off chance that anyone on the call doesn't know, is essentially, it doesn't have to be two-factor, it can be multi-factor. It's the use of an additional factor to verify your identity if you or someone else is trying to log in. So let's say somebody's trying to log into your Twitter. If you have two-factor authentication set up, you will receive a code, not the rando person trying to log in as if they're you, but you will receive a code saying, hey, are you trying to log in? Like, enter this code and then I'll let you in. And if it's not you, you just won't enter the code. If it is you, you know the code, you put in the code, problem solved. So it's the single best thing that you can do probably to protect a lot of your accounts. And on several social media accounts, we'll show you how and where to do that quickly. I don't necessarily recommend you do it in real time. I also don't recommend you start changing all your passwords in real time. I just recommend you make a note to yourself to sit down for like 20 minutes and set up password managers later. Right. So why do I have a thing from BuzzFeed up here? Well, most of the time, the work that I do is actually focused on online abuse and training journalists and newsrooms and writers and publishers to defend themselves against online abuse. And BuzzFeed has been very good at historically trying to train its staff in protecting themselves from attacks and abuse online. And what they tell all of their staff, and they came up with this wonderful graphic, so they let me use it, is to be more mindful about separating your personal and your professional self online. For a lot of journalists, they can't just go offline if they're abused, right? They need to have a public presence to do their work. I understand that, I respect that, and I encourage it. It's free expression, right? But you can be thoughtful about what account you're using for which purpose and accordingly adjust your settings, which is what we're about to delve into in great depth. So that means something like, it doesn't mean you have 2 Twitter accounts, 2 Facebook accounts, 2 Instagram accounts, because you would probably lose your marbles trying to keep track of all that. Although I know people who do, and it's not a bad idea. It's just hard to keep track of it all, and it's not always practical. So think about what you're using an account for. So for example, you might have a private Instagram with photos of your baby and your puppies that is only available to friends and family, and you have the settings on that account set super private. But you might use your Twitter almost exclusively, or ideally exclusively, professionally, in which case your Twitter settings might look different than your Instagram settings. You definitely want to have several different emails. You want to have a private email that's just for friends and family. You want to have a public front-facing email that you can list online. And you also ideally want to have kind of like a spammy junky email where you're using it for promotions or for whatever it is, like signing up for random software. And have at least 3. It's annoying, but you can set, usually if you're using Google or something else, you can set it up that you can flip between them relatively easily. And kind of apply that philosophy in any other areas of your life. I also tend to recommend that people have a front-facing public sort of dummy phone number and their actual SMS, or I should say, sorry, SIM-based phone number. That's what I do. I use Google Voice. That's not for everybody, but I strongly advise it because if your cell phone gets doxxed, it gets published online all over the place, and people start leaving you voicemails or abusing you or harassing you, it's very, very hard to change your SIM card-based phone number. It's a lot easier to just swap out and get a new Google Voice number. I'm gonna take a minute. Oh, there's a question here about, all right, let me pause quickly.
Yeah,
Harlo,
yeah, let's go to some of these questions, yeah.
So are there risks with password managers? Harlo, we can tackle this one together, but you can go first and I can weigh in.
Sure. So password managers are great. I recommend people use them, and I recommend people just take the patience to incorporate them into their lives. So I think there was another question that was, using saving passwords instead in another program and keep a file hidden somewhere with an innocuous name. The reason why a password manager is preferable to that is because a password manager is already encrypted, so you don't have to, like, instead of hiding something, you can just have something that's properly encrypted. Like, instead of hiding an entrance to your house, what you're doing is you're just displaying like you have a big lock that works on your house. So it's pretty much like that, plus the fact that it helps you generate passphrases, and that you can, like, it's a software program that's organized in a way that you can keep other little details, like, you know, that you might need in order to keep an account safe. It's just a way better way of organizing things. So that's my two cents. I mean, there are, of course, you know, pitfalls to everything. Like, what happens if you forget that password that opens up the password manager? What happens if something gets hacked? What happens if I lose my computer and all of my passwords are gone? Those are all different things that you would have to think about, but there are strategies for mitigating them. And ultimately, like, when you do take the practice and take the patience, you become a lot better at thwarting those risks.
Thank you. And the quick question about, do you have a different password manager for work, for your work computer and your personal one? That's up to you. I mean, I definitely think you should distinguish the password. If some people are actually kind of cajoled / forced into using password managers at work, I definitely don't recommend that you centralize everything in your work password manager, because if you are to leave that work, it might create complexity. Some of the password managers have like silos where you can put like work stuff and home stuff.
Yeah.
1Password lets you kind of divvy things up in that way. So I think it would just be good to kind of like mark and label things differently and make sure that it's not strictly connected to a work-based product, that it's something that you could take with you if you leave a job, because it's really annoying if your passwords are all stored in something that you only have access to in your workplace. And then, so there are some questions that are emerging about social media. What about Google Voice with strong 2FA SIM jacking? I would not recommend using a Google Voice number for two-factor authentication. I strongly recommend using, well, I don't recommend using your SIM-based phone number for two-factor authentication either. I strongly recommend using an authenticator app like Authy or Google Authenticator. And if you're really serious about your cybersecurity, which I encourage you to be, you can actually get a YubiKey or a security key, which is something Harlo taught me about. It's a little bit more cumbersome, but it's not that bad if you know how to do that. But at the very least, use an authenticator app. It's really better not to use your phone as an authenticator, and several people have been chiming in about why that might be. I'm going to move us forward because I think we are, even staying half an hour late, we're rather 15 minutes late, we're going to start running out of time. And I'm going to start talking you folks through, and some of the questions that have been popping up on social media, you folks will see will get answered if we can get through the content fast enough. I'm going to start walking you through some of your social media settings. So we're going to start with Twitter. I should just point out there are a couple of people who've brought up quite, like, I don't want to say their names because I don't want to identify anyone in a recorded webinar, but have brought up somewhat like personal experiences that they're having and things that they're struggling with. You can go ahead and email me. I might not be able to solve the problem, but maybe I can point you to resources, or I can pull on some of the people I know. So if you have a particular situation, you don't know how to navigate it, or you haven't been able to get help at work or elsewhere, email me, because I don't want to address your personal, kind of situation in a recorded webinar, which is going to go up on YouTube out of respect. But so we're going to start with Twitter. We're going to talk about Twitter fairly quickly. I am not going to I don't recommend everyone start setting up two-factor authentication in real time on their Twitter account, because it's a little time consuming. But I do strongly advise you on your Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, your social media accounts in particular, but really all of your accounts, to set up two-factor authentication. And I just have the slide here so that you are reminded where that is. It's very easy to find. You go to more, you go to account, you go to security. It walks you through how to do it. Again, you can do it through your phone. I recommend you use an authenticator app. If you can only do one and you're afraid to use the authenticator app, a phone is a place to start, but ideally use the authenticator app. And it's a really good idea to save your backup codes. And Harlo, do you want to just explain to people what backup codes are and why they need to save them?
Yeah, I guess the good news about two-factor authentication is it will keep your accounts super duper safe. The bad news about two-factor authentication is it will keep your accounts super duper duper safe. So if you lose, that app, let's say like you drop your phone and it's crushed because you brought it to a protest or something like that, and you lose your two-factor authentication codes, it can be really, really hard for you to get back into that account. And sometimes even the service itself can't even help you, and you just lose that account forever. I still haven't been able to get back into my Tumblr account because I'm that good at security. So what you got to do is whenever you're presented with a backup, or whenever you're enabled two-factor authentication, you're going to be presented with a backup code, or sometimes it's one backup code, sometimes it's several backup codes. Regardless, take that opportunity to save it someplace safe. You could put it in your password manager. That's something that some people do. You could, just save it and put it on a USB stick that you keep in your house. That's something else that some people do. You can print it out and put it in your sock drawer. Whatever it is, make sure that you save those two-factor auth backup codes, because you never know when you might need them to get back into an account.
I recommend doing it through a password manager. That's made my life a lot easier, but that's just... So now I'm going to I actually encourage you folks to do in real time. Go into the settings on Twitter. Well, you can do it on the phone app. I find it easier, but you can do it on the computer app too. And take a look, first of all, at your profile. It's not a setting, just look at your profile and make sure that where you have, I don't recommend you put your birthday at all. But if you, for some reason, feel really strongly about telling everyone your birthday, or rather telling yourself your birthday, at least set the birthday to only you. And just take a quick peek at what you actually have written in your little profile blurb, and make sure that it's not something that has private information someone could use to identify you or harm you or abuse you. So that's just something to think about. And then if you go into the account settings and privacy, account apps and sessions, I strongly advise you to take a look whether there are any applications that you don't even realize are signed into your, or rather linked up or connected to your Twitter account. And also take a look at where you're actually logged in. And if you don't recognize the places you're logged in, first of all, revoke that login. Second of all, change your password, because it could mean that somebody is logged in as you somewhere else. I will just remind you, though, that I had a minute of panic, and then I realized a lot of us are in maybe parts of the country that are different from where we normally work, or we're traveling or whatever. Most of us aren't traveling now, but you know what I mean. Just make sure that you've thought about whether it could be that you're seeing an unfamiliar location to the login because of somewhere you are or have recently been. But if you see something that you see a place you haven't been to and have nothing to do with, revoke that login and change your password. And in terms of unauthorized applications, that is something that happens where a lot of us out of convenience have sometimes in the past decided to log in through Twitter or log in through Facebook or log in through Google, so that you don't actually have to create a new username and password. And I cannot emphasize strongly enough that that's not a good idea for the most part, because you are linking up some random app to some of your most sensitive accounts like Gmail, Twitter, or Facebook. And so at least this lets you see where you might have done that in the past and revoke that access. Are we going to give people some time to do that, or okay? I mean, we don't have a lot of time. I mean, I think that right. I was trying to talk long enough. People could do it while I was talking.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I will add, yes. Harlo, were you trying to say something? Okay. I've created a checklist for people to follow for some of this stuff, which I will try really hard. Blythe, remind me to put that checklist into the resources sheet I'm going to send you folks, so that if you run out of time to do this stuff now, you can quickly go through the checklist and check stuff off. This stuff, I'm going to leave this slide up for a little bit, and Harlo and I will talk you through some of what these things are and what they mean. Again, you're going to have to make a call about the pros and cons of doing some of these things. Some of this stuff will work for a journalist. Some of it works less well. Some of it only works if you're in a particularly difficult situation and you're in a really bad episode of abuse and you have to turn certain things off, but then you would like to turn them back on. It's your call. But if you go to settings and privacy in Twitter, and then you go to privacy and safety, there's a whole row of things that are worth taking a look at. Harlo, talk me through protect my tweets.
Sure. So protect my tweets comes in handy in the event that you find yourself, I guess, in the midst of a very, very particularly bad case of internet harassment. And so what that means is that no new people can follow you and view your tweets from that account that they're logged in. And it also means that no one new can actually, like even if they're signed off of Twitter and they just visit the website, not logged in, they can't see any of your tweets. That said, the only caveats are that still people who had followed you before, whether you knew them or not, they're not going to automatically get kicked out. They're not going to be blocked out automatically. So the followers, that it pretty much just freezes your follower count. And also know that nowadays people do, there's a very effective intimidation tactic of like screenshotting people's old tweets and archiving them and stuff like that. And so this option won't preclude that. But the good thing is that, you can turn it on and turn it off as you want to. And when you're ready to be public again, feel free to disable that.
And it's really a toggle, so it is really easy. Like for reporters who deal with a lot of abuse regularly, this is a pretty useful feature. It doesn't work for everyone because it does reduce your visibility, and that's not always something reporters want, which we respect and understand. So it's your call. In photo tagging, which is not shortly below that, you have the option to choose between anyone, only people you follow, or off. I personally prefer to have the photo tagging off. You can set it to only people, and you can set it to only people you follow as a kind of compromise to that. But you don't want any random person to be able to tag your photo on Twitter or on Facebook or anywhere else. I would also, again, disabling receive messages from anyone is not for everyone. I know that a lot of journalists and other folks rely on communication through their DMs. They want people who don't necessarily follow them to be able to reach out to them. This is something that you might do if you are entering, or you think that you're about to enter, a period of abuse where you're worried about something you're about to publish, and you might want for a few days to turn off receive messages from anyone. In discoverability, I strongly advise you to turn off let others find me by email, phone number, and to uncheck sync address book contacts. There is no reason why your phone address book contacts should be synced to your Twitter. Like, you're exposing people on your phone. It's just not necessary or a good idea. And I sort of feel like if someone is close enough to you that they have your email or phone number, they don't need to use it to find you on Twitter. So I just don't see the point of having that checked off. And then Harlo, talk through the sort of tweet location and location.
Similar to what we were talking about with EXIF data, it's really not necessary for, for metadata about your location to be displayed with any tweet that you do. If you wanted to tweet about a place where you are, you would do that, and it would be evident in the content of the tweet. So you don't necessarily need to give Twitter the ability to make that decision for you. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's needed. There hasn't even been anything interesting that people have done with this feature for so many years. So I highly recommend turning that off. And also know that you can delete the historical location data had you had that feature turned on as well.
Great. And for personalization and data, that's not so much a security or safety thing as a privacy thing. I personally have, on all of my social media accounts, personalization and data turned off. What that effectively means is that you're not going to get hyper-personalized ads based on what you're looking at or tweeting or searching, but I don't really care about that. And it at least reduces some of the kinds of tracking that is happening constantly in real time. It does not actually reduce all of it, unfortunately. These apps are really built to track you all the time, but I personally feel more comfortable have personalization and data turned off. Okay, so here is where we are in terms of the webinar. We have about 5-6 minutes left. And we just finished going through Twitter. Those are Twitter, the settings on Twitter are a lot easier than the settings on Facebook, which are long and complicated. So what I propose we do is we will quickly walk you through some of the really core settings on Facebook, and then we're gonna wrap up. And then we will post this online, and folks who wanna come back to it can see it. I'm not gonna belabor this point, but you should also set up two-factor authentication on Facebook. We don't need to talk about how to do that now. It's not very hard to figure out. And I've got a little, pathway for you. But instead, I'm going to talk you through, and I'm going to play sort of in real time a video that shows you on the right, kind of shows you how to do this on your phone. But so, well, do we want to do this? Maybe not. Maybe we don't need to do this. I can just talk you through it. So in security and login on your Facebook, you want to do the same thing you did in Twitter. You want to make sure that you're not logged in from anywhere you don't recognize. And if you are, you want to log out from that place and change your password. You want to turn on get alerts about unrecognized logins so that if somebody is trying to log in who's not you, at least you find out about it. And you can choose 3 to 5 friends to help you if you get locked out. Not everybody does that. It's not for everybody, but it is a useful way to ensure that you don't get locked out of Facebook. And then again, so it's in a different part. Security and login is one place. If you go to apps and websites, you can remove superfluous apps and websites that are connected or linked to your account. There's no need to have a bunch of random websites connected to your account. I'm going to keep going. I know that people don't have maybe enough time to do all of these things, but again, I can send a checklist around to everyone who registered for this webinar, which talks you through how to do all this stuff. Harlo, do you want to just quickly talk people through who can see their posts? Just like
Sure.
Basic recommendations around limiting who can see your posts on Facebook, who can see your friends.
Yep. Yeah. So you have different granular options about who can see your posts, pages, and friends. And I think like the first 2 are kind of self-explanatory. You do what makes sense for you, understanding that you want to privilege your privacy. But the last 3 actually have to do with discoverability. And why that's interesting is because you don't want your friend groups to be abused in a certain way. So you don't want random people on the internet to see who it is you're friends with, because that might put your friends in a position where their privacy is being abused. Also, you might not want, especially if you have like, you know, if you want to keep your Facebook off, I guess like out of the public sphere, not allowing people to find your Facebook page via your phone number or email is really, really beneficial. And the most important thing, I think, is limiting the visibility of your profile on search engines, which means that no one should be able to like Google your name and then have that list of, you know, like who your friends are, what your Facebook page is, et cetera, because as if you can think of that like BuzzFeed infographic that Victoria showed you earlier, like this is your private life, so keep it private.
Yeah, so I'll just say briefly about this slide that you want to go into your timeline and tagging settings on Facebook and just think through who has the privilege of posting on your timeline, who has the privilege of tagging your photos. I would limit that as much as possible. And think about basically when your posts are public, who it is that can follow you and reply to things that you are posting. Again, it depends on how you use Facebook. A lot of folks nowadays use Facebook effectively privately, so you can limit a lot of this stuff just to friends or like people you know. If you're using Facebook publicly, I would clean up your Facebook and make sure that you don't have a bunch of really private information, photos, friends and family, all that stuff on there if you don't need to, or consider making a public Facebook page and using that for the public stuff and saving the rest of the stuff just for yourself and your actual friends. And finally, and I'm sorry that we had to rush a little bit at the end, this is pretty important. I would just encourage you on Facebook, just like you did on Twitter, to disable location services and location history. You don't really need Facebook telling everyone where you are all the time. It's just not necessary, and it's not necessarily safe either. So I strongly advise you to turn that off. And I think that's it. I think we've really run, we've done a full an hour and a half. A lot of folks have stayed on. I appreciate that. I'm sorry we didn't get to every single question, but I want to offer a huge thanks to Harlo for taking the time to do this. I always learn so much from her. Thank you, Harlo.
Thank you. Had fun as always.
And like I said, I will, once I process this video and put it up on YouTube, I'll send it to all of you. I'll send you some resources. Please be sure on Thursday at noon to check out our webinar on mental health and trauma. And let me know if there are other webinars you would like to see us cover here. So take care of yourselves, stay as safe as you can, and all of us press freedom organizations, PEN, IWMF, CPJ, Freedom of the Press Foundation, and DART, we're here for you. So if you need us, email us.
Yes, please do.
Bye.
Bye.